Hello, everyone. I am Martin Barakov. I'm going to be presenting on Decolonial, Delinking, a New International Economic Order, and Climate Catastrophes. Let me see, share my screen. Can everyone see it okay? Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. So I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about the paper. Effectively, with the gradual rise of political and economic multipolarity and I guess, a new sort of shift away from American hegemony, questions of non-alignment and a revived third worldist approach to international political economy have been rekindled. Following the end of the Cold War, large-scale privatization and the deregulation of national economies were presented as the path towards modernization. However, there have been many efforts since then to push back against the anti-worker policies associated with the Washington Consensus, including but not limited to struggling for the nationalization of industry, land, and natural resources throughout the global South. For instance, the development of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, or ALBA TCP, across left-leaning governments in Latin America not only provided an alternative to the prospective free trade association presented by the United States, but it also represented a significant shift concerning delinking from conditions of neocolonialism. ALBA demonstrated that alternatives to neoliberal development exist and can continue to be rooted in the legacies of national liberation movements and non-alignment cultivated by the Global South during the Cold War. And in 2018, the United Nations General Assembly, or the UNGA, reiterated the need for a push toward a new international economic order, building on the principles set out initially in the 1970s, but adapted for the acute crises associated with the ongoing and prospective climate catastrophes. At this point, a push for a global South-based, quote-unquote, Green New Deal is necessary to delink from neocolonialism fully. So in the late 1980s, we had the so-called revolutions of 1989, whereby the process of the Cold War ending took place with the fall of the state socialist governments in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Market economies and multi-party liberal democracy appeared to be victorious over centrally planned economies led by a unitary Marxist-Leninist political party. Internationally, the fall of the Eastern Bloc proved to be very hard on a variety of countries in the Third World that struggled throughout the 1990s, principally Cuba and North Korea, who had lost their main political allies and trading partners. As such, neoliberalism and widespread deregulation of industry and the active embrace of private property rights and so forth was perceived as the path towards modernity and prosperity, although this illusion would be made apparent by the end of the decade. Additionally, it represented a significant blow not only to orthodox Marxian analyses of economic development, but also dependency theory as a whole. So, the Battle of Seattle in 1999, which was one of the most important events in relation to the rise and establishment of the anti-globalization and ultra-globalization movements, marked a significant turning point in relation to public opinion over neoliberalism, both within the United States and internationally. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, was effectively delegitimized, to use the words of Max Eil, and the renewed discourses relating to third worldism, political non-alignment, and so forth started to reemerge in both academic and activist circles around the world. Here we witnessed the rise of a more regionalist political approach throughout Latin America, starting with the election of Hugo Chavez and the Fifth Republic movement in Venezuela back in 1998. In 2004, the first step towards creating the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, or the People's Trade Treaty, took place through the Cuba-Venezuela Agreement. Stemming from the deterioration of both political and economic relations between the United States and Venezuela, the Chavez government pushed this regionalist approach as a means of counteracting the proposed free trade agreement that was spearheaded by the United States, which was called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, or the FTAA. It played a crucial role in the rise of the Pink Tide, which was the electing of various social democratic and democratic socialist governments in the 2000s and 2010s, most of which joined ALBA at different points in time. For example, Bolivia joined in 2006, Nicaragua joined in 2007, Honduras in 2008, Ecuador in 2009, and so forth. Other states did as well, and some of the aforementioned countries have left and not rejoined, while others have left and rejoined at differing points due to political differences that took place. For instance, Bolivia left in 2019 under the unelected government of Jeanine Áñez, and later rejoined following the landslide victory of and re-election of the Movement for Socialism, or the MAS IPSP party, in 2020. And the reason I mentioned Bolivia specifically is because the country is a very, very important case that's examined here, particularly in relation to the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, which took place in the country in 2010 and was critical in advancing a global South-based environmental politics. Indeed, the People's Agreement at the conference targeted capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and interventionism as the principal actors in the environmental destruction of the Earth. The agreement was radical insofar as placing the bulk of the problems associated with climate change on the developed world specifically, with the following quote from the agreement itself. Developed countries, as the main cause of climate change, in assuming their historical responsibility, must recognize and honor their climate debt in all its dimensions as the basis for a just, effective, and scientific solution to climate change. Then following this, there were demands that were put in place that refer to something or a bunch of policies that have become relatively mainstream at this point, including widespread reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the restoration of atmospheric space in developing countries, assuming the costs associated with technology transfer to the developing world, an assumption of responsibility for impending migration crises that stem directly from climate catastrophes, and so on. So moving forward and technically backward, 1974 marked the United Nations General Assembly's adoption of the, quote, Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, end quote. This proposal stemmed from the view that while most of the Third World had undergone a process of de jure decolonization, many still felt as though a de facto economic colonization continued to exist vis-a-vis neocolonialism. As such, the NIEO pushed for resource equity and equality, deviating from the norm of multinational corporations maintaining control over these resources in the developing world and subjecting workers to abhorrent conditions imposed from overseas. Additionally, it emphasized the importance of national self-determination in all its forms, and outside of forcing the international financial system to undergo a massive overhaul, one of the principles pushed by the NIEO was the emphasis placed on South-South cooperation as a means of delinking from neocolonialism and instead pursuing an economic model that emphasized interconnectivity between developing countries themselves. As mentioned earlier, in 2018, the UNGA reaffirmed the need for such an international economic model to exist, but it was adjusted for the crises presented by climate change and in accordance with the goals set out by the United Nations in regards to policies aimed at environmental protection. So what would a Green New Deal, a legitimate one, one that's rooted in the interests of the entire world and not just social democratic parties or plans in the global north necessarily look like? Max Io provides some valuable insight pertaining to this, and this is a quote. A people's Green New Deal should be eco-socialist. It should identify what eco-socialism is, identify it as where we want to go, and think about how to get there. Eco-socialism is not green social democracy. It aspires to eliminate capitalism not merely locally, but globally. And it is explicitly anti-imperialist and pro-third world state sovereignty, because states are necessary containers in our historical moment for third world popular development and for managing climate debt payments. So, of course, we have various ideas such as ecological Leninism, eco-socialist degrowth, the idea of buen vivir, and so forth. But the Latin American examples of buen vivir, which roughly means living well, provides a small outlook on what such a world could necessarily look like. Living well in this context does not refer to the individualistic approach to understanding human prosperity, but rather how a single person operates in conjunction with the context of the social world and the natural environment around them. Some have argued for an ecological Leninism or a degrowth movement of sorts, but regardless of what one wishes to call it, it can all fit relatively neatly under the concept of eco-socialism, at least for the purposes of this paper and struggling against the problems associated with climate change. Another quick quote from the same book, which is titled A People's New Green Deal, I highly recommend it, is for a People's Green New Deal to be planetary and eco-socialist, it has to build anti-imperialism and internationalism in from the outset. The difficulty for this process lies in how much northern capitalist and northern consumerism rests on south-north value flows, which is also extremely important in analyzing, some sort of new international political economy that deviates from the norm of international neoliberalism, which we have grown so accustomed with today. So with shifting international relations, the rise of military coups d'etats in formerly colonized territories by the French has gained varied degrees of success, with popular military governance taking hold in countries like Mali and Burkina Faso. Both countries have moved towards delinking with the French by halting, say, uranium exports, such as was famously recently the case in Niger, or expelling the French military presence in the countries in question. While not nearly as dominant as a mode of politics in the 1970s, national liberation is still dominant throughout various locations around the world, be it in relation to Palestinian resistance, continued dissident Irish republicanism, or struggling for a free and independent Western Sahara. Additionally, technological developments relating to containing or reutilizing carbon emissions are being developed as well, although not nearly quick enough to account for the continued destruction of the environment internationally. Cuba has been effectively making more with less through moving away from industrial monocropping and towards a more sustainable, sovereign, and resilient agricultural sector, with small farms routinely accounting for more and more of the total share of national food production. And perhaps most importantly, in relation to the paper itself, 2024 will mark the 50th anniversary of the NIEO Declaration at the UNGA in 1974. There is increasing engagement in the literature about the development and continued push for such a world order, but time will tell as to what direction the world will be headed in regards to struggling against neocolonialism and in fighting the effects of climate change on the world as a whole. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. Our next presentation is by Vincent Collins. You can go ahead, Vincent.
Okay, I'm just going to get stuff set up and then I'll go. But that was excellent. Thanks so much. Okay. Okay, can people see my slides okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it's great to be here and thanks to all the organisers at the GLRC for putting this conference together. So my research is Labour Union Experimentation for a Just Energy Transition. So a bit about me, my name's Vinnie Collins. I'm originally from Scotland, but I've lived in Toronto for 7 years. I did my Masters and I'm now doing my PhD at York University. So I've just begun the 4th year of my PhD and I'll be starting my fieldwork in a couple of weeks. I'll be speaking about my research so far, happy to receive feedback and learn alongside you all. And as I was starting to say, I really think there's loads of overlaps and a lot of all your presentations sound excellent, so I'm looking forward to hearing them too. Okay, so yeah, in terms of research topics, so my research explores the potential of labour unions to be a key site of organising the working class in order to win the transformative climate action necessary for decarbonisation. In response to the major fault lines in the change of work, collective actors such as unions are engaged in experimentation in a big bid to dictate how work of the future can be better work. And arguably no social actor is more consequential to shaping a clean energy economy with good jobs than labour unions. The emerging field of environmental labour studies has begun to examine labour's engagement with environmental issues, but to date, literature has failed to attend to how labour unions have secured better work and strong climate policies that can shape the clean energy transition. Such analysis is critical for several reasons. Over the past century, labour unions have been crucial in fighting for new workplace rights, better public policies, and more democratic governance. So it raises the question, can labour action today not only win good jobs and better labour standards, but also help mitigate the climate crisis? So about the framework of the project, my research is a comparative analysis of 3 contexts: Ontario, where I'm based, Scotland, where I'm from, and New York, in which labour is in all 3 are examples of where labour unions are engaged in attempts to shape a just energy transition. So the research seeks to capture the nuances and histories that shape today's context, taking a comparative approach, assessing key variables critical for unions to successfully achieve a just transition in their workplace and in government policy and investment. The research will use a critical political ecology framework. So this will help examine, and this has helped examine how collective organising, workplace struggles and labour politics account for union resilience and experimentation, and that's how I'll be using it in my research. So the first case I look at, New York, will focus on the Labour Coalition Climate Jobs New York, which then stemmed from the Workers' Institute at Cornell University that produced a report grounded in workers' experience and policy research. From this report and the coalition's ongoing work, Climate Jobs New York embarked on a proactive agenda that was focused on building up labour unions' power, working to realise the opportunities from the transition to a decarbonised economy, and then organising and mobilising to secure these victories. The Labour Coalition secured a union jobs guarantee for an offshore wind project that will deliver half of New York's energy needs by 2035. This approach is also gaining traction in other states in the US, with the potential to act as a blueprint for securing climate action
My
around the...
apologies, Vincent, to
Yep, sir.
interrupt you. We're not able to see your slides. We're able to see your notes. I
Oh,
mean, we are
sorry.
okay as long as you're okay.
Yeah, I can change that. Sorry about that. I think I've clicked on the wrong
No
thing.
problem at all.
Thanks
I
for...
did try, putting in the chat, but you were not
Okay,
able to see
is
it, I
that
guess.
good
Sorry.
now?
This is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So I look at that example out of New York, which is gaining traction. And I'll also look at a more recent example of Build Public Renewables Act, an effort to build public democratic ownership. So the next context I look at is Scotland, which has legislated one of the first just transition commissions in the world, and with Labour at the table. So since its creation, both commissions' reports have made several recommendations which the Scottish Government has promised to act on. However, deeper scrutiny of the just transition legislation and the Scottish Government more broadly reveals more of a story of labour unions being left behind. A recent report revealed that the first offshore wind auction in Scotland only generated a tenth of the jobs that the government promised. The government has also faced criticism for creating a public energy company and a public investment bank, only to underfund both. And when it had an opportunity to take over a factory in Campbelldown in the north of Scotland that was building wind turbines, but had to go into liquidation, the Scottish Government reneged on this promise, despite universal support from unions to bring this factory and make it a manufacturing hub for renewables. So the last case I look at is here in Rotario, and as we probably know, the outlook is not great. So I look at Green Jobs Oshawa, which was a plan by a coalition of people impacted by the GM Oshawa plant closure. So it was a group of a coalition of grassroots movements, workers that worked at the plant, environmentalists, Indigenous organisations, which basically put forward the idea of converting the General Motors complex in Oshawa, the largest car manufacturing hub in North America, into a publicly owned centre for EV vehicles. So today's context, where you have governments subsidising corporations in EV manufacturing, exposes the kind of green capitalism trajectory that Green Jobs Oshawa really was trying to prevent, and that public democratic ownership could prevent where the profits could be invested in communities and workers rather than corporations. In the US, we've seen leadership at UAW call for a just transition to EVs, with calls for substantial wage increases, a 30-hour work week, and calls to ensure the EV plants are using unionised labour. And just recently, they secured a victory on this, as General Motors will now include electrical vehicle battery production work in the UAW's National Master Agreement, a major demand which was secured by a proactive labour union. So I'm just going to finish off with some initial findings, thoughts that's coming out of, as I said, I've not done field work. I do that in a couple of weeks for the first time. So this is mostly coming out of the literature. So by comparing Scotland, which was the world's first public auction of leases for offshore wind in Scotland, to an auction that came a few months later in New York, you can see the impact of Climate Jobs New York, that of a proactive labour union coalition. One project delivered a prevailing wage, unionised jobs, apprenticeships that will build the unionised workforce of the future. The other has failed, and as of today, there is still no collective agreement in place for offshore workers in Scotland. However, there are some promising signs in Scotland. A report on offshore workers in the oil and gas sector has workers calling for public democratic ownership and calls for transitioning their jobs from the oil and gas sector to offshore wind. These workers are unionised. However, the question of resources for embarking on these campaigns has came up, particularly with the UK in the midst of one of the largest strike actions we've seen in a generation. And the aforementioned manufacturing plant in Campbelltown is no longer in existence. So I just want to kind of highlight the importance of manufacturing to a just transition. This is where the majority of jobs are going to be in renewables. And it highlights the need to ensure these jobs are unionised and do not follow the kind of green capitalist trajectory of precarious, low-paid work. It also highlights the need for public democratic ownership, which unions have largely supported. Actually, just the other day at the Labour Party conference in the UK, that despite large opposition from the kind of higher brass of the Labour Party, Unite and other unions were able to vote overwhelmingly in favour of a public ownership resolution. I also want to touch on the kind of race to the bottom in terms of wages, labour standards and regulations that happen when offshored, and which we've seen with free trade agreements and globalisation, thanks to global north governments and corporations, which has to be reversed. So we've seen some organisation tackle this in Canada. We have Blue Green Canada, which is an organisation built from unions, the steelworker unions and others in Canada, which are pushing for, rather than a race to the bottom, a race to the top in terms of supply chains and with the push to buy clean and local. But this also needs to come and be bound in solidarity with the context in the global south, particularly, which have been decimated by extractivism. There's been calls for climate reparation and cancelling the debt, which trade unions should support. Trade unions for energy democracy have supported public ownership bids in countries in Africa, and international trade unions have some rhetoric on this, but again, it's not enough, and there's no point in having a state by state just energy transitions. We know we won't have a planet to live in if we work according to nations. So I also lastly kind of want to touch on another example in New York, where DSA organised and won the Build Public Renewables Act, which will move the power grid in New York to renewables by 2030. And importantly, it will create tens of thousands of green union jobs thanks to ironclad prevailing wage requirements, project labour agreements and Buy American provisions. It will also bring back public ownership through the New York Power Authority, the US's largest public utility, to plan, build and operate renewable projects. Also, the current UAW strike could be consequential. Wins like this recent victory can raise the standards of what can be achieved for members and build the power needed to shape a just energy transition. So I'll just conclude by saying the hope of the research is that the focus will again be directed towards labour unions, their role in fighting for justice for workers in their communities, and the implication that this collectivisation could have for the climate crisis. And thanks a lot. And yeah, sorry about those technical difficulties.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Jan Kostuchuk from University of Victoria. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to set this up here. Can folks see this now? All good, okay. So hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm joining you from Lekwungen and Wasanich territories, otherwise known as Victoria. The research that I'll be presenting on today stemmed from a pilot project that I was hired to lead with a nonprofit out here called the Worker Solidarity Network, or WSN, which is a workers' rights nonprofit that supports workers across the province with various grievances. And my approach to this research was greatly informed by my own experience in the food service industry, but it was also approached with the knowledge and tools that I acquired in my master's research, which explored more broadly the precarity of food service work during the pandemic. All right, so existing literature suggests that, of course, food service work in general is precarious in that it's often highly gendered and racialized, as well as largely unprotected, meaning that these workers are often in non-unionized positions, or they might be even entirely unaware of their basic employment rights. And there's much literature to suggest that this is by design of the sector. And so in work that is already precarious, it makes sense that when the 2021 heat dome struck here in British Columbia, the nonprofit that I work for was receiving complaints from low-wage workers about these conditions. And it was also during the same time that WorkSafe BC received a 180% increase in worker complaints that were coming through. And over 1/3 of those complaints were actually related to heat indoors for workers. Conceptual theories of environmental justice tells us that working class people are, of course, at higher risk of exposure to environmental harms, but there is a research gap when it comes to exploring the impacts of extreme weather for indoor workers. This is a space that we may not immediately consider when we think about climate change and food service work. So much of the existing literature on this very connection looks more at the environmentally damaging impacts of the sector, like food waste or higher carbon emissions. But in this project, we really wanted to uphold the voices of the workers themselves to better understand their experiences and how they cope with extreme weather at work. And so to do that, we set out to answer these two research questions, which are, how are food service workers in BC impacted by extreme weather? And then what are the key changes needed to secure the health and safety of them? So this was a community engaged research project, of course, and given the precarious nature of this type of work, it was very difficult to recruit participants. So we ended up using quite an eclectic approach to gather data. We distributed a survey, we hosted a focus group, and then we opened up calls for one-on-one interviews with workers to ensure that we were meeting them where they were at and providing accessible avenues for them to share their stories. So in total, we had a relatively small sample. We heard from 31 workers across BC in various food service positions like barista, cooks, servers, dishwashers, etc. And 4 major findings emerged. The first is consistent with existing literature. Of course, this work is precarious because of realities like lack of job security, low unionization rates, low pay, exclusion from health benefits, part-time hours that disproportionately fall on women, and normalized mistreatment. And normalized mistreatment is something that I was quite interested in exploring in my master's research, but with this added layer of climate, in this specific example, some of these norms that we were hearing of mistreatment in a climate context were from workers who mentioned that to cope with heat, they're often standing in the walk-in freezers to cool down. So to illustrate the precarious nature of this work further, I wanted to share a couple quotes from participants. The first here is from a cook who said, quote, "The cost of living is so high that you don't want to say no to a shift in case you lose your job. I feel like I'm caught in a stranglehold. Everyone is dispensable." And a fast food worker who I connected with who said, "The payment, it's not that good. They pay me a minimum wage and, you know, the paycheck is always small and Vancouver is really expensive." So it is no surprise then that this industry becomes even more precarious when extreme weather events hit, like heat waves, wildfires, and floods. The next theme that emerged is that employment conditions worsened during extreme weather. So despite basic labor protections, workers experience lack of breaks for hydration. So some workers disclosed to us that they were not allowed water bottles at their workstation during the 2021 heat dome because some employers did not want these bottles to be public facing. Lack of knowledge on paid sick days was evident in our research. So some workers were experiencing fatigue and headache from wildfires, but they were not made aware of the province's 5 paid sick days a year. And for those that were aware in this project, many explained that they didn't feel comfortable using these 5 paid sick days out of fear of experiencing decreased scheduled hours or even termination. Next, 80% of participants reported that they experienced changes to their position when extreme weather events hit. So we spoke to, servers who were taking on hostess duties, helping with dishwashing duties and kitchen prep, and balancing more than the one role that they were hired for. And of course, lastly, income insecurity. We know that many workers cannot afford to miss out on their scheduled hours. And so here we have a couple quotes from workers, one who said, "Why would we justify taking a day off when it means we don't have as much money to survive?" And another server who said, "I feel like one missed day can lead to being fired. We've seen it happen to other people." Our project also revealed that working conditions are worsened when extreme weather hits. So the majority of workers reported that their workplace does not implement adequate protective measures when they should be. So when we inquired about, any provision of PPE or specific protocols around climate, we were met with responses from participants who said, "Not at all, they do nothing, and absolutely not." Most workers also described facing amplified physical and mental health concerns, again, ranging from heat exhaustion and general panic to even eco-anxiety at work. We heard from cooks standing in front of hot grills during extreme heat, and fast food workers in drive-through windows during wildfires, who discussed the precarity of that. And we also heard from one back-of-house worker who mentioned that they stood in 2 inches of water for a week during the 2021 floods in November. So these were the types of conditions and insights that we were hearing that really illuminated this intersection between changes in climate and the precarious nature of food service work. Dress code was another sub-theme that emerged in our data. So we know that wearing loose and breathable clothing is, a safety measure to mitigate risk of heat-related illness. But we were hearing from workers who were still expected to show up in their long black pants and shirts with thick cotton aprons during extreme heat. And in one specific story, we had a worker share that their employer pulled them aside to address the fact that he doesn't want customers to be seeing employees sweating on shift. And as you can see here, one fast food worker told me, "That's the worst part in the heat wave. You have to work in the required clothing. Sweating is not something I do purposefully." And lastly, 88% of participants reported that they are not comfortable refusing unsafe work, even when climate disasters hit. Here we have a quote from a restaurant cook who shared, "I have this very specific story of this one day where it was just so hot, I couldn't rationalize why I was still at work. It was so insanely busy and so much was going around, like the forest fires, the heat itself, and feeling like there's nothing that I could do. While I was working, all I could think of was climbing over the counter and pushing my way out of the restaurant and getting the hell out of there." The very last finding from this research is that solidarity amongst workers was very prevalent. This was especially a reality during the 2021 heat dome. Workers mentioned that they were taking it upon themselves to look out for one another through ensuring buddy systems, doing check-ins with each other, offering to swap or pick up shifts. And we even had one barista who mentioned that she paid out of pocket to bring a fan to the coffee shop that she was working in, just to provide a little bit of relief for herself and her coworkers. And so it was 97%, all but one worker identified specific measures that they needed to ensure their health and safety. Some of these measures that workers were telling us they would like to see us campaign on and demand for include flexible and breathable dress codes, accommodation for hydration, training on evacuation procedures, appropriate work rest cycles, and scheduling work hours to minimize heat exposure. Over time, I'll just quickly share a couple last quotes. This one here from a server who said, "We were just trying to stay safe, so we put wet rags into the freezer and then put it on our heads. We didn't care what we looked like serving customers. We're all in it together." So, from these findings, we developed this list of recommendations that you can read here. For the sake of time, I won't read them out loud, but these are what we will be campaigning on at the nonprofit. And if any of you are interested in becoming involved or curious to learn more and engage in praxis, I do invite you to check out our membership. There's a QR code here and both of my emails. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jen. Our next presentation is by Aidan McNally from McMaster University. Go ahead, Aidan.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and get going. Oh, no, that's share. Okay. Can folks see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great. Wonderful. So hi everyone, my name is Aidan McNally. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee. And I'm going to be talking today about my master's research project, Building Power, Labor Unions, and Climate Change in Ontario's Electrical Sector. And so, there's no question, especially on this panel, that climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. The IPCC's 2022 report states that emissions must be cut globally by 43% by 2030 to avoid irreversible climate change. And due to their vested interest in secure employment for their members and their role as representatives with structural power to shape the workplace, unions have much potential to shape the climate transition. Most of the current climate literature on unions and climate change in Canada has followed the jobs versus environment debate, as Canadian unions have histories of defending unionized jobs in extractive industries, regardless of their environmental consequences, such as in the case in the oil and gas sector, coal, and auto manufacturing. However, there's also an effort to theorize beyond this tension and chronicle union support for environmental policies, such as green jobs initiatives, as many, including myself, believe that unions are strategically placed to play a more influential role in bringing about the type of transformational climate policy that's needed. So my project grapples with geographer Matt Huber's argument that to win climate demands, organized labor should focus on one specific sector, the electrical sector. Drawing from Jane McAlevy's theory of targeted sectoral power, Huber makes the unique argument that the electrical sector is strategic for the following reasons: the historic public oversight of utilities, the disruptive potential of strike, high unionization rates, and high public reliance on electricity. The utility industry is very political, but the current production of electricity in Canada is far from clean or green. For example, Canada still relies on carbon-intensive forms of electricity generation, including 11% from natural gas, 7% from coal. Nuclear energy accounts for 15% of electricity generation nationally, though for the purposes of this study, I didn't consider nuclear a carbon-intensive form of generation despite its reliance on non-renewable uranium core. Instead, I was looking at prospects for decarbonization, policies that would reduce carbon emissions through limiting reliance on fossil fuels. So for example, the mass electrification of transportation or manufacturing, which could amount to huge GHG emission reductions if the electricity powering transportation and manufacturing was produced by low carbon energy sources. For Huber, the issue of climate change must be understood through a class lens. He argues that a corporate extractive class is depleting the Earth's resources for profit And given the capitalist motive that is driving carbon emitting extraction and production, Huber contends that unions must be at the center of the fight for workplace and state intervention to rapidly decarbonize the economy. So my research project was aiming to take Huber's analysis and apply it to the Ontario electrical sector and answer the following questions. How are unions in Ontario engaging with this issue of climate change? What forms of strategic power do they hold? What barriers, past and present, inform how unions are approaching the issue of climate change? And do unions envision themselves as playing a role in the fight against climate change? And does this align with what Huber prescribes? I primarily focused on two major unions representing electrical workers in Ontario, the Power Workers Union, which represents primarily nuclear workers, and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which primarily does contract work for various different sectors. I also did look at the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers Union as a comparison case study, given the union's leadership in favor of the Kyoto Protocol in 2002, but we'll primarily focus on the first two. My methods included doing semi-structured one-on-one interviews with union leadership, as well as document analysis to understand unions' positions regarding climate change. So in terms of what I found, I argue that unions in the electrical sector are active forces in supporting decarbonization. However, this is being primarily done through governmental advocacy for sectoral investment and training, lobbying, and leveraging coalitional relationships with industry to meet their goals. While having membership straddled across low carbon electrical generation like hydro, solar, wind, nuclear, and high carbon sectors like natural gas and coal, this creates an opportunity for union leadership, however, to take a bigger role and a transformational vision and adopt a transformational vision for the sector. However, factors such as sectoral and material interest, job insecurity, and historic political orientation of unions have led unions to adopt adaptable partnerships with government and industry in ways that serve the interests of their members at the expense of more progressive commitments to climate action. The climate crisis has not yet necessarily compelled unions to go beyond their current strategies. For example, for the Power Workers Union, they are pursuing a narrow government advocacy strategy for the expansion of nuclear energy. By leveraging their relationships with employers and their hyper-focus on expanding nuclear energy, the types of contradictions that the union must navigate amongst their members is largely minimized. They largely circumvent the jobs versus environment dilemma. Their ability to extract gains from transactional relationship with employer and government creates little incentive to adopt alternative strategies, both for members and its current leadership. Its leveraging of the insider status, they often undermine the credibility of renewable energy projects, and their unwillingness to address nuclear energy's limitations to meet climate timelines are evidence how the Power Workers Union's approach is driven primarily by their economic interests that happen to align with environmental goals, and their resistance to consider the idea of meeting climate targets through renewables instead of nuclear. It ultimately undermines their credibility as an environmental leader. The IBEW has adopted traditional craft union strategies, such as attempts to monopolize labor markets in emerging sectors through credentialism, and has meant that the union is well positioned to take advantage of a decarbonized economy. Unlike the Power Workers Union, the lack of job security due to their high concentration in the construction sector has motivated them to adopt creative strategies. For example, they developed an EV installation credential program, which will be critical to the expansion of an electric grid. However, their advocacy for electrification is less a result of a radical political orientation, but rather of strategies commonly associated with business unionism, strategic forethought, and anticipating changes in the sector. While their use of institutional power has extended to lobbying the government in favor of pro-decarbonization measures, their strategies fall short of engaging with their carbon-emitting sectors of their membership, such as their membership in coal and natural gas, something they calculate is too politically volatile. Instead, their political energies have focused on funding for training and advocacy for key standards, for safety standards that would support the hiring of unionized workers in the renewable sector. In terms of key takeaways, perhaps unsurprisingly, when challenged on the short timelines for GHG reduction that would likely involve the rapid winding down of natural gas and coal-fired generation and the rapid expansion of renewables such as solar wind, union leaders were hesitant. Given the negative job implications for their members, union leadership defaulted to discussing the importance of jobs at the expense of global climate targets and timelines. The approaches taken by the IBEW and the Power Workers Union Ontario suggest that the jobs versus environment dilemma is not equally experienced among workers, even within the same sector. Factors such as job security and insecurity, the quality of jobs, membership composition, and sector influence what strategic choices unions feel are open to them. The two unions considered in this analysis and the relative decarbonization of the Ontario electrical sector speak in large part to the effectiveness of traditional business unionism, but also of largely politically driven reforms that have reduced the carbon impact of the Ontario's electrical generation. However, it's possible that the limitations of a reform versus transformational approaches to decarbonization have not yet materialized. Finally, just some key areas for future research. Unions have been potentially, I would argue, a part of the shift towards a net zero electricity that is clearly very politically favorable right now. However, it's definitely not the full scope of the picture. So looking at what factors have created that political context, such as the climate movement or international climate goals, would be a worthy area for future research. Also, I would raise a concern about relying on the private sector to build renewable energy, which is currently the strategies being employed, and that very well could happen at the expense of unionized jobs, given the very low union density in renewable energy. Finally, a limitation of this research is I spoke pretty exclusively with union leadership, and investigating kind of the perspectives of the rank and file would absolutely be a worthy furthering of this project. And that's it. Thank you.